So, today I want to talk about the move towards normalizing child labor in the United States. Last week, I had talked about how a lot of companies were starting to move in the direction of hiring teenagers instead of paying people a living wage. And as I've been doing more research into this, I've been finding a lot of disturbing information. Namely, I've been discovering that more and more businesses and states are starting to see child labor as an acceptable solution to prop up businesses. And it should go without saying that it's not. It's not an acceptable solution, and it should never be normal or normalized. Children deserve a chance to have an education, to be able to just be children, and to not be exploited for other people to make a profit. The fact that we are debating this as a society and considering making this a mainstream practice again in the United States should be a testament to how irredeemable a system that prioritizes profit over all else is. Because we should never end up back here. We shouldn't have ended up here in the first place. And it does need to be said that we have never actually truly stopped this practice, both globally and in the agricultural sector. And honestly, if you ask my opinion on the matter, if you can't maintain a business without being able to employ in children and to practice child labor, perhaps the possibility that you should not be in business is something that you should deeply consider. That said, let's take a look at some of the further examples of this happening and go over what's going on. So we have here an article from The Guardian. Child labor laws in some states may be weakened as U.S. industries look to hire teens. Experts fear increased stress and loss of sleep among students, as some Republicans want to allow teenagers to work longer hours. U.S. employers are recruiting teenaged workers to solve their difficulties in hiring and retaining workers, and some Republicans and industry groups are pushing for looser child labor laws to allow those industries to put teens to work for longer hours. They have businesses from across the United States advertising that they're hiring 14 to 15-year-olds due to the, quote, labor shortage, which includes restaurants in Pennsylvania, a pumpkin patch in Liberty, Missouri, a Burger King in Ohio, and a McDonald's in Oregon. Each employees such as Chipotle have expanded recruiting efforts this year to target younger workers. Meanwhile, you have other restaurants from across the country increasing their reliance on teenage workers under the age of 18. And you have restaurants in Arkansas, which I did mention in the previous video, offering to let teen workers work for 1 hour on their homework before their shifts. And this is the kind of thing that we're seeing happening in a lot greater numbers. In fact, according to this article, teenage employment in the US surged to more than 32% in the summer of 2021, the highest since 2008. And if you recall, 2008 was around the last time we had a real major issue in terms of the economy. So there just seems to be something tied to hiring younger workers when there's economic issues. And for the first time in history, the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds fell below the rate for our 20 to 24-year-olds. That is a disturbing trend to see happen. So they are hiring younger and younger in order to get people to work for them. And when we look more into that Pennsylvania restaurant thing, we have this article here. Some businesses are hiring 14 and 15-year-olds to address staffing shortages. The businesses have lowered their minimum hiring age from 16 to 14 in an effort to meet staffing needs and keep their businesses afloat. I wouldn't be open without my teen employees, said Keith Fetterman, owner of Fox's Pizza Den in Leechburg. With the stimulus money and the weekly increase in unemployment benefits, I have found that some older people didn't want to work. The restaurant employs about 15 teenagers. Now again, it needs to be said, I've said it before, it's worth just mentioning again. The fact of the matter is unemployment had nothing to do with this. Unemployment benefits have been cut for a while, and it's not bringing back people into a lot of these jobs. People got tired of the way they were being treated. People can't afford to pay rent, food, and medicine off of the amounts that they were being paid at these restaurant jobs. And generally, the stimulus money was not even enough to talk about. So realistically, this is just excuses for these restaurants not being able to stay open without, in some way, shape, or form, either exploiting people by paying them less than a living wage, or in this instance, by employing teenagers as young as 14 and 15-year-olds. Again, the issue with hiring children so young is that because they've not had jobs before, because of their age, they're easily exploitable. You can manipulate them much more easily as an employer. There's a lot of issues that go into hiring younger and younger people for their own mental well being and health, and the fact that this will lead to burnout and probably long term effects. But in addition to all of that, they are an easily exploitable class of people. Now, when we scroll down further, we find that Tim Thompson, Vice President of Operations for Primary Aim, owns 76 franchised Wendy's restaurants in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. He said he lowered the hiring age from 16 to 14 at all the restaurants earlier this summer. I'm just going to be real. If you own 76 franchised restaurants in the states of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio, you're not in a position where you're struggling financially. So, no, I don't feel bad for you, and I do not feel like this person has a right to be hiring 14-year-olds to be making profit off of. We did it out of need, Thompson said of the decision, citing staffing shortages. It's been a blessing. We've hired about 500 14 and 15-year-olds. They're higher energy, hardworking, and they show up because their parents drive them. So, what are you trying to imply with that? Are you trying to imply that you have young, exploitable workers who are working hard for you because they haven't been burned out yet? Because you want the experience of being able to be the one to drive them to the point of burnout? That's exactly what's probably going to happen. And Thompson even says a lot of them were earning money to help supplement family incomes. Many of their parents had been laid off during the pandemic. But nobody wants to work and they're not hiring people. So let's just turn to kids. Why didn't you try to offer the parents a job? Why didn't you try finding some sort of other way, like, I don't know, raising the wages at your restaurant so that you could actually pay for somebody who's, a qualified adult? And meanwhile, Thompson here is happy with this. I feel like this is here to stay. It's been a success. So how long until the next situation where it's even more successful in Thompson's eyes to try to hire somebody even younger? This is a disturbing trend, and I need to mention this. There is an issue when it comes to restaurants like these. A lot of children at the ages of 14 to 15, a lot of young teens, shouldn't be handling a lot of the equipment at a lot of these restaurants. It's considered dangerous. And if you have somebody pretty much running the restaurants exclusively on these 14 and 15-year-olds, that's a disturbing trend, and that really needs to be looked into. Now, if we get back to the Guardian article for a moment, when it gets to the state side of things and not just businesses, we find that the labor shortage concerns have actually galvanized an effort by some elected officials, mostly Republicans, to scale back some child labor regulations. And given everything else that the Republicans have been doing and passing through their state legislatures, I'm not even surprised by this at this point. We've had the anti-abortion stuff. We've had a lot of the voter rights being removed, a lot of racist legislation passed. So this is just adding to the list of things that I would expect from the Republicans to put out. 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat in Ohio State Senate have recently introduced a bill to expand the hours minors under the age of 16 are permitted to work in the state from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. during the school year with a parent or guardian's permission. Now, here's the thing. If you're someone who's in a place where maybe you don't have a choice because you've been laid off during the pandemic, you might be more willing to let your kid work till 9 p.m. without a social safety net in place. And the fact of the matter is that if a child at the age of 14 is out working till 9 p.m. and they've gotten off of school at, say, 3, then they're probably working from 4 to 8, 5 to 9, something like that. And then they have to do homework and then go to bed, and then they need time to socialize with their peers because that's something that is healthy and normal for children to do. And you actually have some situations where kids are working upwards of 35 hours a week, Maybe not at the 14 to 16-year-old range, but 16 to 18-year-olds certainly are in some places. And this is becoming more and more normalized. And then the article goes into the Wisconsin situation that I talked about in the last video. But one thing that I wasn't aware of that I do want to add to that is that Wisconsin Republicans have successfully passed several bills in the last decade to weaken child labor laws. So this isn't even something new, it's something that's been worked on long term. Because a lot of the Republican strategies are to break things down over time so that it doesn't sound as drastic in the moment as we slowly normalize each thing after each thing. So basically, they have in 2011 eliminated limits on the number of hours and days minors ages 16 and 17 could work. They eliminated work permits for 16 and 17-year-olds and replaced all uses of the term child labor in state employment statuses with the term employment of minors in 2017. So, of course, if you just sugarcoat it and instead of calling it child labor, you call it employment of minors, it suddenly sounds that much better. Which is kind of the same vibe that I get when we talk about the unemployment rate of teenagers, when we should be talking about how many of them are, in school, how many of them are being able to survive and maintain themselves without the need of having to work. That number should be low, as in we shouldn't be hiring people at that age. We should be reducing the amount of people in the workforce. And one way to do that is to make college a right and to make it available for everyone. Because a lot of the reasons that a lot of teenagers at the ages of 16 to 18 work is so they can pay for college or start to pay towards that, or pay for anything they might need in terms of necessities in a few years. If we start to eliminate a lot of those costs and a lot of that, we can have children focusing more and more on their education, which would probably be better for them in the long run. Even if we do need to reform our current economic realities when it comes to education and how education is done. Now, we also know that scientific research has shown that working long hours while attending high school can actually have negative academic and behavioral impacts on teenagers. A psychologist who had researched the impact of work on adolescents while at University of Washington explained that much of the research on adolescent employment has focused on formal types of employment that generally occurs at an age of 16 and above. What this bill does, I think, is it opens up and encourages young teens to enter into the workforce. And that's the thing also. There hasn't been a lot of studies recently done on basically what happens when a 14 or 15-year-old is working. But we do have a long history of that, and it has negative psychological consequences. It ends up having a significant impact on the economy. It drives prices down for adults as well, and it ends up putting employers in a position where they can easily exploit more people. Generally speaking, if you're able to hire, say, an 8 to 12-year-old to do the work that you would normally pay for a teenager or an adult to work for, then you're going to pay the child because they're more easily exploitable. You can generally pay them less and drive down wages. And then you can tell the adults, well, I could just hire a child, so, you should be grateful. And that's the kind of thing that we've seen historically. So it has negative impacts on the economy and for the child themselves. And for 14 to 15-year-olds, that's still on the cusp of that area where they probably should be kept out of the labor force. Now, it's also worth noting that this is not the only type of thing that's happening. There's been pushes, and this doesn't even surprise me, but apparently it came out very recently that a McDonald's franchise employee was pressured to violate state employment and child labor laws and then fired, according to a lawsuit. So allegedly, this person was hired as a shift manager for a McDonald's restaurant, and they were only 16 years old. And because of that promotion, the manager at the store is alleged to have disregarded California state labor laws that limited the number of hours that she, a minor, could work, often demanding that she miss school or stay late on school nights in order to complete illegally long shifts. She was forced allegedly to cooperate because she was told that her job would be in jeopardy if she did not comply, and she alleges that she was expected to be on call all day on days where she was not scheduled to work, including school days at work odd hours, which forced her to miss even further school. And the fact that this employer felt like they could get away with it and probably did it in order to, assuming they actually did do it, to probably run their restaurant and run their location since they can't find workers, this is kind of where we're seeing things shifting. Now, I briefly want to take a moment and just show this poster that is on screen right now, which was from the early 20th century, where it says every child should work, but the work must develop, not deaden. Encourage work if it trains the child to be a better citizen. Stop it if it merely makes money for parent or employer. We must not grind the seed corn. And the sentiment here is one that I think often gets overlooked. There's a lot of people who I think still have the mentality that, oh, well, hard work can help a child and help develop them and all these other things. Here's the thing I need to point out. If you're talking about actually training somebody to develop a skill, to learn, to get an education, to grow as a person, then sure, you could make the argument, especially if they are earning a fair amount for themselves, that in that practice of training or an apprenticeship, that maybe there's some legitimacy there. Apprenticeships and trade schools are still a type of education. They're often overlooked and underappreciated, and there's a lot to be said about that. And certainly going to get an education in the way that we often see in a place like the United States trains children to have certain capabilities. And even if education does need to be reformed, that's not what our issue is. The issue is that most of this is being done to generate profit and to exploit labor of children for parents and employers. There's no way you can tell me that a person working at McDonald's is getting lifelong skills and lifelong lessons and lifelong trainings, with especially as how demeaned those positions have been treated towards adults for a long time. Not that I think anybody who works in those positions deserves being demeaned or mistreated, but it needs to be said that for as much as the society often does so, what skills exactly do you think are being applied to a child to affect their long-term goals, except to continue working in that type of business? And again, to be exploited and make money for the employer. You have to think about what the work is going into. And that's always been the argument around and the issues surrounding child labor, is that it's consistently being exploited. And the thing is, we're seeing this happening now. We're seeing this happening and manifesting in a similar way, and I'm worried about the slope slipping into younger and younger ages in time. You know, we have this article that came out in Business Insider where a Subway franchisee said that she had to pull her 16-year-old son out of school to work. We have that thing that happened at the McDonald's, allegedly. And, you know, they're claiming, oh, well, we don't have people to work for us. Well, people aren't going to work if they're not being paid a living wage. And you pulling your 16-year-old son out of school is only causing harm to yourself, and to your child, not to anybody else. And in the meantime, we've seen, like what I have on screen, a Burger King is hiring $13 for adults who are openers, $12 for adults who are in the day shift, and high school kids get paid $9.50 to $10.50 an hour to start. And then you can apply at the website or call. And this is the type of thing that we used to see historically that I mentioned before, where the lower wages are applied to the kids, which ends up driving down the prices. So instead of paying people a living wage, you end up just paying the cheaper prices to kids. We have the same thing happening at a McDonald's with $12 an hour for 18-plus-year-olds, $11 an hour for 16 to 17-year-olds, and $8.50 an hour for 14 to 15-year-olds. So guess where the trend is going? They're going to start trying to save money and hire more and more 14 to 15-year-olds. And the problem, of course, is that $12 an hour in most places is still not enough to survive on for an adult. So naturally, they're going to start hiring kids. And kids are just going to walk in, and the 14 to 15-year-olds might be kind of satisfied with $8.50 an hour if they don't have other expenses to pay or they're desperate to help their families. And that's how you start recreating child labor. And it's a slippery slope from there. You know, you have Dollar Tree with an ad that says, now hiring minors. And this is where we're at. And I mentioned this briefly at the beginning of the video, but I need to come back to this. Child labor in the US was never truly eradicated. The agricultural sector has had it for generations. The United States Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 prohibits those under the age of 14 from working in most industries, restricts hours to no more than 3 on a school day until 16, which of course we've seen some states start to push against, and prohibits hazardous work until 18 for most industries. And again, that's one of my concerns when it comes to these restaurant jobs and to other industries, that if it's hazardous or dangerous, that they may not be in a place to properly work a lot of that equipment. However, these regulations do not apply to agricultural labor because of outdated exemptions based on an agrarian society largely left to the past. So where that comes from is that previously a lot of people needed their children to work on farms, and so that was fought against. We were talking about small family farms, not the type of agricultural industry that we see right now. Today's farm worker children are largely migrant workers who deserve the same protection as their young the youth working in other less dangerous occupations. Agricultural work is very dangerous. There's a lot of tools involved, and you have massive tractors and all these other things that are being used. And you also have children, of course, as young as 12 and 14 years old out there working as migrant workers in these agricultural areas where they are getting put in contact with pesticides. And of course, because they're smaller, they end up having a much lower rate of being able to process all of those pesticides and chemicals. So there's a lot that goes into this. But yeah, child labor has been an issue for a long time. And it is again worth noting which children are the ones being put into these conditions. So when we look at all of this, I think it just needs to be said that the idea of keeping children out of the workplace has not been a radical one for well over 100 years. And yet, here we are. We have politicians and businesses trying to push these boundaries and hire more and more teenagers in order to make a profit. These positions can and will have long-term consequences for children and teens, and they often only get the benefit of the employer. So the children don't really get any benefit from this. Again, that's kind of the point. The employer gets cheap labor with easily exploitable workers who don't negotiate, who don't have any sort of job training and experience, who can make the argument and claim that, oh, you can fill out your resume and you could save up to buy a car or buy your first home. But these are realities that just don't exist anymore. These are kind of dreams that have been long since eradicated, especially as housing prices go up and up. And especially when it comes to restaurants and agriculture, these are some of the most dangerous places for children to be working in. And the machinery and tools that are available there and that some children might be being put on are extremely, extremely dangerous, and they should not be putting in the position to be asked to operate these machines. Now, I'm not saying that that's happening consistently, and there are specific laws around that, but if we can see a situation where maybe kids are having their hours extended past where they should be, it's not impossible to think with what we've seen for adults going through employment and how their own needs are ignored, that a child who maybe doesn't know better or maybe is really scared of losing their job because they don't have an alternative but to help their family might make certain sacrifices and decisions that might lead to long-term sustained injury. And if the employer pushes, they probably will get what they want in that moment. And given this trend, it would not surprise me as well if we start seeing, especially the Republicans, but in general, a lot of politicians starting to move towards lowering the working age or expanding hours even further. And if anything, we learned from history, it's that this is not good for children, it's not good for workers, it's not good for the economy, and it's not good for anybody but the business owners. And it really does need to stop here and now. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Terra, and I thank you for watching.